Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me today is a brand new guest, Stephanie Carter, FNTP. Let me make sure I get this right. Functional Nutritional Therapy Practitioner, which is actually a human certification for nutrition. So today's topic
Correct.
is equine nutrition basics. And I am so excited because as a horse owner, I've been a horse owner, oh my God, like 40 years. And I never get to speak directly with somebody who's an equine nutritionist
Mhm.
because most of us are going to these free seminars at the feed store that, took me a while, finally figured out these are basically sales reps for companies that
Yes.
don't like if I went in there with questions, they could just recommend products, but they couldn't really answer my question.
Sure. Hmm.
And I know we're similar in that you want to know how things work or why they work.
Yes.
Yeah. So I thought we could start with either maybe you could describe a little bit what your specialization is or what you do. Like just
Sure.
because none all of us go nutritionist, but don't really know what that means. So what does that
Right.
mean?
So I'm a little different than your traditional agricultural educated nutritionist. I'll just kind of give you a little background on myself. I've worked as a veterinary technician for about 20 years, small animal, mixed animal, large animal, and I've also had horses my entire life. So very horsey background. But I found when I was looking for more of a nutrition background, the science that we have for the horses in particular is a solid 20 to 30 years behind the information we have for humans. So
Yeah.
I went back to school to get my human certification in functional nutrition, so that I could pull what I knew was applicable to the horses from what we already knew from the humans. So what you hear from me would be completely different than what you would get if you walked into, a feed store or you called a supplement company or one of the big feed companies. It's going to be a lot different. Um,
Okay.
so I like to find the root cause of the problem, and support it as well as I can nutritionally, without, using a lot of the conventional methods that I don't think work quite as well as we think they do.
Yeah. No, same vein with training.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
like I find human sports medicine is about 50 years ahead of equine sports medicine.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. And so
Absolutely.
sort of having to look out of the box. And I know like nutrition has become super important with horses that have metabolic issues. That's
Mhm.
usually where people start to go down the path of exploring nutrition.
Yes.
But like one of my burning questions is sort of like, what is just like if we say protein, fat, carbs, which is how we're
Mhm.
sort of trained to think, what's
Mhm.
good basic nutrition for a horse? Like what are we kind of looking for?
Well, so I usually give my clients a list of 5 ingredients to avoid. So if you're in the feed store and you're looking at a feed tag, most people get hung up on the guaranteed analysis, which is kind of that table with the percentage of, everything micronutrient and carb or macronutrients in the feed itself. But I actually don't even care what that says until we look at the ingredients in the bag. And if it has corn, wheat, soy, molasses, or canola in it, that feed is going to be highly inflammatory. And when I say inflammatory, I mean soy in particular is a known hormone disruptor, known endocrine disruptor. So long term feeding soy, especially conventional soy, um, can cause a lot of our metabolic issues. But the more systemic inflammation that we have from what we're eating on a daily basis or what the horses are eating on a daily basis is going to lead us down a road of deficiency as far as the vitamins and minerals go, which are like the spark plugs to the body. If you don't have enough of all of your vitamins and minerals in balanced ratios because they work together so synergistically, if you don't have those, the body can't function the way it needs to. And the longer we let those deficiencies go long term, the more likely we are to develop disease. That's essentially the two building blocks for disease are systemic inflammation and micronutrient deficiency.
Interesting. So what do you mean by systemic inflammation? Like
So
I get the vitamin mineral thing, but when you talk about systemic inflammation, are you talking gut? Are you talking throughout the body? It could manifest anywhere, or what does that mean?
all of the above. Usually the health of the gut is going to impact the rest of the body. I think a lot of us as people know that if we have GI issues, whether that's dysbiosis or an imbalance of the microbiota, which are the organisms that live in our intestines, or leaky gut, things like that, there are elements of what we're eating that are leaking into the bloodstream, into the rest of the body where it's not supposed to be. And so it causes a lot of inflammation, meaning it could be things from pH balance in the body. So if we have a more acidic body, we're not able to function as well as we should. We can't absorb things as well as we should. So then we go down that road of the micronutrient deficiency, which are your vitamins and minerals. And so it's kind of this landslide effect. The more things we're eating that cause inflammation, the more we're depleting all of the micronutrients and getting the body into a situation where it can't function optimally. So the organ systems can't work together the way they're supposed to.
Interesting. And so you're
Mm-hmm.
saying like the five ingredients, corn, wheat, and by wheat, I always see wheat midlands in the
Yep.
feed. That's wheat. Okay.
Yes.
So
Mm-hmm.
corn, wheat, soy, molasses, and canola
Yes.
oil.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the ones to avoid and I think those are in almost every
Right.
prepackaged horse food. Because I have a horse with severe food allergies
Mm-hmm.
and he can't eat any pre-mixed feeds.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a question I get a lot is, okay, well, if I can't feed those five ingredients, that's in everything. What do I feed?
Yes.
And my response is I am a big proponent of a species appropriate, nutrient dense, real foods diet. So as close to what they were essentially made to eat. So that means forage based, healthy fats, because contrary to popular belief, fat does not equal fat. We need healthy fats, good balance of omega-3 and 6 and 9. We need all of those to have healthy hormone production, transport, all of those things. And then I typically round out with a really quality vitamin mineral supplement. And that's kind of your basis of what you should be feeding. It should always be forage first. Um, and you just kind of round it out from there.
So the old adage of horses eating oats or grain or high carb diet, not so much anymore.
No,
Yeah.
there are places to use oats, but I typically stay away from them for the most part. We don't have, for the most part, the clients that I'm working with usually don't have horses that are that high performance that they need the extra carbohydrates. A few endurance horses, a few upper level event horses, things like that, we can incorporate that. But your average, amateur owner type horse doesn't need that much as far as
Mm.
carbohydrate goes.
And so you're saying forage based is in hay, grazing, maybe cubes or pellets as the main part of the diet.
Correct.
Great.
Mhm.
And I know like I grew up out west where all the horses ate alfalfa. Like that's what we fed. And when I
Right.
moved to the East Coast, everybody's like, oh, alfalfa makes them hot. And I thought they meant temperature hot because I
Mhm.
was like, oh, you mean spicy hot. Like, I mean, you
Right.
mean like too much energy hot.
Right.
And I don't find that at all. So can you sort of talk about alfalfa, the values or drawbacks versus other types of forage?
Sure. So alfalfa is extremely energy efficient, meaning the horse's body can use it to create a lot of extra energy very easily, very quickly. Um, Most of the alfalfa now in the United States is GMO, which means it's laden with glyphosate, which is Roundup. So it gets sprayed while it's growing, and a lot of companies are now using the glyphosate to dry it after it's been cut. So they soak it in glyphosate to dry it out. So typically, I stay away from alfalfa for that reason alone, because I'm not, keen on feeding the pesticides
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to the horses. There's no amount of processing that removes that from the feed once it's on the alfalfa. But there are actually some studies coming out of UC Davis now that, yes, it's showing that the alfalfa is very energy efficient, but it's also showing that it can create an increase in volatile fatty acids in the hindgut. And when that happens, there's a microbiome die off. And that kind of creates an environment that's conducive to hindgut acidosis, which we all know is the reason we end up with hindgut ulcers. So I stay away from it for both of those reasons. And then there's a relatively new study out that's linking it to photosensitivity. So if you're in Florida or you're in one of the southern states where it's hot and very sunny, most of the year, it's another reason to kind of stay away from it. There are other better options, I think. Sainfoin is a great heritage breed grass that has all of the benefits of alfalfa without the drawbacks. It's high in omega-3, a little bit of a natural dewormer property to it. And the company right now, there's only one company in the States that's growing it. That company is called Stable Feed. And they, I believe, have a few distributors, or maybe one or two at least, in Florida. They're starting to expand some more. But so for the listeners that are in Florida, they do
How do
have
you
distributors there.
how do you spell that? Sane for
Sain
uh-huh.
Foin. And they do ship. They'll ship the bags as
Sane
well.
for
If you visit their website, they're pretty easy to find.
Okay. Stable feed, sane foin is the name of the hay or the forage.
They make it
Okay.
in a pellet form.
Okay. Excellent. And then what about like uh Timothy Hayes, or like I'm thinking my local feed store, what could I pick up that would be a better diet for my horses to get the
Sure.
corn, wheat, soy, molasses, and all that out of there?
Right. So typically, I do most of my diets are based with a Timothy pellet or cube, whichever is easiest for the client to get a hold of. And then I round out with one of two fat sources. My favorite is a product called Cool Stance. It's a
Oh
coconut meal.
yeah, I use that.
That one's great for horses that tend to be, more metabolic prone or more prone to being heavy, easy keeper types. Um, for my higher performance or higher metabolism horses, like thoroughbreds, I deal with a lot of thoroughbreds because I'm based in Virginia. So we have a lot of
Yes.
thoroughbred sport horses. I usually use a product called Renew Gold Original for them.
Renew Gold Original.
Mm-hmm.
And what type? I know the Cool Stance is a coconut meal fat
Mm-hmm.
supplement. And what about the Renew Gold? What is that made out of?
It has the Cool Stance in it, but it
Oh,
does have a little bit more carbohydrate and a little bit more fat from some rice bran and stabilized flax. And I find that the higher metabolism horses or the high performance horses we kind of touched on earlier need a little bit more carbohydrate than your easy keeper type. And I do think
yes.
it's kind of important to note that if you switch your horse to a forage-based diet and they're not thriving, it's likely because the balance isn't quite right, or there's some underlying condition going on, whether that's a vitamin mineral deficiency that's not quite getting addressed with the vitamin mineral that you're using. So I think when folks switch over to this sort of forage-based approach, it's usually best to work with a nutritionist who is well versed in a forage based diet just to get you on the right track. And then after
Yeah.
that, you should be good to go.
And then what kind of vitamin minerals, like what do you recommend as far as, because I'm imagining it's a scoop of something.
Yes. So there's
Okay.
four that I really like, and it really depends on the bio-individuality of the horse. So just because something is, textbook balanced doesn't mean that it's necessarily balanced to the individual needs of your horse. And that bio-individuality can be affected by everything that they've done in their life before you got them, what they're doing right now, what area of the country they grew up in. All of
Hmm.
those things kind of play in. So you kind of need to work with somebody who can take those sorts of things into account when you're selecting a vitamin mineral. But the four I work with the most are High Point Grass by Horse Tech. Lone Star Trace is another one that's by Horse Tech. Um, Vermont Blend is by Custom Equine Nutrition. And Kiss Trace is by Thorn Bottom Farm.
Oh yeah, I've tried the Kiss Trace before. That was
Mm-hmm.
very good. Vermont. So the High Point Grass and
Mm-hmm.
the Lone Star Trace are both by
Horse Tech.
Horse Tech. Can't read my
Mm-hmm.
own handwriting. And then the Vermont blend is by,
Custom Equine Nutrition.
okay. And then the Kiss Trace is by which
Thorn
company?
Bottom Farms.
Thorn Bottom.
Thorne.
No, that's really helpful because if somebody's having issues right now,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in that information, you could start to make some changes. And
Yes, and
then,
like I said, if you make the changes and your horse isn't thriving, there's probably something else going on that would warrant working with a nutritionist like myself or someone who is forage based um, savvy, so that they can help you along figuring out what your horse's bio individual needs actually are, because they're not all the same. We can calculate a diet to the textbook standard of, it needs this much carbohydrate, this much fat, this
yeah,
much protein, and it's supposed to have minimum daily amount of this vitamin and that vitamin. But if we just did that for every single horse, we can inadvertently be causing an excess or deficiency of nutrients, whether
yes,
that's macro or micronutrients,
yeah,
because we're not addressing the individuality of that horse. And humans are the same way. We all can't do keto. We all can't be paleo. We all
right.
can't live on the standard American diet. Like, we all have different needs. And so I think that's the biggest piece when you're starting down this journey of changing away from a conventional feed more to a forage based diet. I think that's the biggest piece that a lot of nutritionists miss, is that we have to be feeding for the bio individuality of the horse, and we have to understand where they came from, what they're doing now, and how that's affected gene expression, and what they're absorbing and what they're not absorbing, and their medical history, and how that might have affected history of antibiotic use if they came off the track, all of these things.
Right.
So it can be very overwhelming for owners in the beginning, but if we take that into account, and especially if you're working with someone who can take all of that into account and help you decipher it all, I think that's when you'll have the most success.
And that's part of the issue, I think, for a lot of horse owners. Like, how do you work with people? Because there is not a nutritionist in every town. Even
Right.
I don't even know if there's one in my state who does what you do. And
There
so,
are very few of us who do what I do. I can
yes.
only think of one other person in the country that I know that does what I do.
Okay. Yeah.
So I actually work on horses all over North America. So Canada, Mexico, United States, all are in my practice. And I typically do things remotely. If you are here in the state of Virginia, I'm in Northern Virginia, within an hour of where I am based, I will come to the farm if you want me to. But the
Mhm.
majority of my consultations are done over the phone, or like Zoom meetings, things like that.
Mhm.
And we work together to kind of come up with the best diet possible. I am the case manager and a nutritionist on staff for True North Equine in
Yep.
Marshall, Virginia. But I also have my own practice that's just nutrition, Indigo Ancestral Health.
Okay, and I'll make sure that when we finish up, I'll have all of your contact information in the description box for the
Oh, that's excellent.
podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I welcome people to reach out with questions, even if it's not necessarily for a consult, but they just have, like a general kind of, my horse has this going on. Where should I start? If, everybody, I try to work within everybody's budget. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to jump on board with doing, a consult
Mm,
initially. If it's just a couple like basic, it's not really in my budget right now to get started with a consult, but I want to make some changes for the positive where, I'm happy to answer questions like that.
yeah. No, and our mutual friend Deb Romero was saying you do
Yeah.
hair testing and that
Mhm.
is really the most definitive way to get to know that unique horse is hair testing. And it
Right.
sort of shows you what's going on over the longer term, like longer than a blood test. Like a blood test is going to give you a sample today, where a
Sure.
hair test will give you a sample for how, I don't know, several months.
So, in the practice that I work for, we find that like the gold standard for testing to see where we are baseline is to do a CBC chem, which is just kind of a basic blood panel, and an HTMA, which is the abbreviation for a hair tissue mineral analysis. And from that, we get not only what's going on in the blood on the day at the time that we draw that blood, but we also get kind of a historic view of what's been happening the last 3 to 4 months. So, with that, coupling those two together, we can really get a broad picture of what's actually happening because the body works so hard to maintain blood chemistry, so homeostasis of the blood, that it will pull nutrients from anywhere that it has to in order to do that as its survival mechanism. So the first place it usually does that is from hair, hoof, and coat. So
Yes.
then if we take the hair tissue mineral analysis, it's not so much about mineral storage. It's not super reliable as far as the actual storage of the minerals, but based on the patterns that are being expressed for those minerals in the hair, we can tell all kinds of things, whether there's dysbiosis, ulcers, predisposition to metabolic issues, whether we have rapid muscle breakdown, which you can also see on the blood work. But with the hair tissue mineral analysis and the blood work together, we can really see how long has this been going on. Is this an acute situation, or has this been going on chronic? Like systemic inflammation, all of those things we can see on an HTMA from one diagnostic that's non-invasive, because we do have a lot of horses that we encounter who are needle shy. And
Yeah.
so rather than put them through the stress of, having to do the blood work right away, if we need a diagnostic that we need to get done, quickly, we can go to the HTMA and get a lot of information.
That is so fascinating
Yeah.
and
And
also easier to mail than blood. So,
absolutely. Well, and that's a test kit. The HTMA is something that I send to clients all the time, and it comes as a full kit, and then they just submit it to the lab, and then the results come back, and then we can sit down and talk about it. So it's not like you have to be local to get that done.
yeah,
And I know there's a lot of controversy about doing hair tissue mineral analysis out there, but I usually find that the folks who are against HTMAs are usually ones who don't understand how to interpret them or haven't been trained to interpret them, because it's not face value. Like a blood value, you have a reference range and it's either in or out of reference range, but it's
right.
kind of a fine art interpreting the HTMA values. And so I think that's where a lot of people are like, oh, they're unreliable, or oh, they're this, or oh, they're that. It's usually because they're trying to look at it like blood, and they're not, they don't understand the nuances of interpreting the results of an HTMA, because it's not cut and dry.
Got it. Got it. No, I think there's an art to even like ultrasound technology versus X-ray. It's like
Oh yeah.
much harder to read the ultrasound than the X-ray.
Oh,
So,
definitely.
yes. Yeah. And so I'm sure a lot of people that come to you first are already having problems.
Yes.
And I
Mm-hmm.
would assume metabolic issues probably at the forefront of people searching for nutritional help.
Yes, definitely.
And that's where you can start to see, like, even not just maybe laminitis, but possibly Cushing's. Is that something you can sort of start to see coming? Or it's not technically Cushing's. What do they call it? The
It's
syndrome.
PPID now.
PPID, yes,
Hmm.
PPID, which is the syndrome of endocrine issues without it
Right,
being a tumor on the pituitary.
right,
Yeah.
right. And there's even a lot of ways to look at that. If you have like an elevated ACTH come back, or if you have a horse who has insulin dysregulation, which used to be called insulin resistance. Now it's insulin
Mm-hmm.
dysregulation because we really don't know. With the horses, we don't know what is actually going on.
Yeah.
But in the practice that I work for, we've kind of taken a little bit of the human adaptation to those metabolic issues. And we're looking at, okay, if there's an elevated ACTH, what's the hormone process that happens in the HPA axis as a whole? So that's hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole endocrine cycle, all of the hormones from those individual organs talk to each other, and there's this feedback loop. And so when an elevated ACTH is apparent on blood work, the way we look at it is that it's trying to stimulate the adrenals to do their part in that loop. So it's not actually that there's a pituitary issue, there's an underlying issue of potential adrenal fatigue, or the adrenals aren't functioning optimally. So we come at it as an approach of reduce systemic inflammation, balance blood sugar, but support the adrenals. And a
Oh,
lot of times
interesting.
we see ACTH come down without having to use percent, which is the go-to anytime a horse has, an elevated ACTH. And sort of a similar thing with insulin dysregulation. It's not actually necessarily that the horse has an insulin issue. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually an indication that the liver isn't functioning well, or it's, stored a lot of toxins and it's at maximum capacity. And so if we support the liver and reduce systemic inflammation, a lot of times we can get those insulin levels to come down without ever having to use insulin wise or metformin or any of those medications.
Wow.
So if you do have a metabolic horse, or a horse that you suspect is, pre-metabolic, but the blood work even looks normal, but they have all those characteristics of fat pads and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
nutrition for them is the key. Like, it really, you can do a lot with the nutrition to turn them around without necessarily having to jump to the conventional medicine route. And a lot of times we see horses that are going the conventional path with all the medications, and they're not getting anywhere because that's not, like I said, the pituitary is not actually the issue. And the, insulin
Yeah.
is not actually the issue. It's that the liver needs help or the adrenals need help. So, we just take a different approach to interpreting a lot of those metabolic conditions.
And would part of, like, say, specific treatments for either the adrenals or the liver also it would it would have to work within a forage-based diet as well. Otherwise, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot.
Right. So if
Yeah.
you just, my saying is, you can't supplement or medicate your way out of a bad diet.
Yeah.
So if your diet is still if your diet is still causing a lot of inflammation, it doesn't matter what medications or supplements you give that horse, you're still creating more inflammation because you're feeding the things that are causing inflammation to begin with. So if we switch to a forage-based diet, you see a lot of systems start to heal, the horses become more relaxed, a lot of horses stop having behavioral issues or being reactive or hot. I've used diet to resolve grade 3 and 4 ulcers when none of the conventional gastrogard and things like that worked. It really, every issue that we see in horses really has gotten to the point where it can all potentially be addressed with starting with the diet first. That's not to say that we can resolve everything with just diet. It depends
Yeah.
on how long it's been going on, how chronic it is. But a lot can be done just by changing the diet to sort of mitigate all of those symptoms of the deficiency. That's basically what disease is it's a symptom of whatever else is going on in the body.
Yeah, no, and from my perspective as a trainer with what I do, the only way I can address a lot of health issues is I go, you've got to get your horse working out of the sympathetic nervous system. I go,
Absolutely.
it's kind of like diet. I go, if your horse is functioning, which many actually do, they're
Hmm.
dominant in the
Hmm.
fight flight nervous system. And I
Hmm.
go, now you're depleting the adrenals, you're
Yep.
running cortisol, you're running all these
Yep.
hormones that are going to affect the horse metabolically.
Right.
So I look at diet, but I also look at it like if your horse doesn't feel safe, nothing you can do is going to override that survival mechanism that affects every single function of the body,
Right. Absolutely.
including digestion, immunity,
Hmm.
metabolics, all of
Hmm.
that.
And even
And
the way we keep the horses can affect, their stress level. And a lot of people believe in this concept of restricting hay, and that's about the worst thing you could ever do for any horse, especially one that already has a metabolic issue, because when we restrict forage, and there's obviously situations where insulin is so elevated that we can't let necessarily have them on the grass because of the fluctuation in sugars in the grass, but um, when we start to restrict hay, it actually triggers signaling hormones in the brain that tell the horse that it's starving. And it's a natural, occurrence that is supposed to protect them in the wild over the winter when,
mhm,
there's not a whole lot to eat, and it's their survival mechanism. But when we turn that signaling hormone on by restricting the forage, they start to hold on to literally everything. That's when you'll see the horses that have exercise resistant weight, and their insulin levels will go up. They'll be stressed out, or they'll go into this freeze mode, which is the phase after fight flight. Then freeze is
mhm.
where they're just so shut down that they feel like they can't express themselves, which is not a place you want your horse to be. But they literally hold on to everything that goes in their body, whether that's a good nutrient or toxins. That's when we start to see all these fat pads come on, is it's the body's mechanism to store all these toxins it's holding on to. So if the only message I could get across to people was, do not ever limit your forage. Feed hay 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Don't ever let them run out. That would be the one message that I would say is super important, because that's how you keep their metabolism healthy. That's how you keep those signaling hormones turned off, and your horses will be a lot happier, and they will start to self-regulate. I know there's a lot of people out there that say, my horse just eats and eats and eats and eats and he never stops. You have to let him do that in order to turn those signaling hormones off. And once
Mm.
we've turned them off and they know they're never going to have their hay taken away from them, for example, the more they will start to self-regulate, and the more they'll
Interesting.
slow down and they'll only eat what they actually need.
Yeah, and I find like in Florida, we have sort of this weird situation where we don't grow hay in Florida. You can't really find hay grown south of the Mason-Dixon line other than what's called coastal, which is a tropical hay that they
Sure.
tend to colic on because they can't
Mm-hmm.
masticate it. So we
Mm-hmm.
have super rich hay, but our grass is like chlorophyll in water. It has almost no nutrition. And
Right.
so I find once they can go out on grass,
Mm-hmm.
they actually equalize like what you're saying. And in
Mm-hmm.
the winter, I have more of a problem because our hay is so rich. We're getting it in from Canada, or we're getting
Right.
like all this super expensive rich hay.
Right.
And I will see them get more anxious because I can't, well, or would you say it's better to sort of maybe reduce the nutritional quality of the hay so that they have something to munch on all the time?
Right. That's usually what I recommend. Is so obviously, and this is regardless of whether we have a metabolic horse or not. I always
Hmm.
recommend have your hay tested, not so much for the nutrient value as the starch content. So
Mm.
those non-structural carbohydrates, which is abbreviated for NSC, you ideally want that to be 12% or less for any horse. If you have a metabolic horse, I recommend trying to get 10% or less NSC. But I think probably what you're seeing with the anxious that you were describing with the richer hay, it's probably because the nutrient quality is much better. And so they're getting what they weren't getting. And so now they have extra energy. So maybe it's not so much anxiety, but that they're feeling better because they have
They're
more
getting more
nutrients.
nutrition.
But yes,
Yeah.
you can kind of counteract that by feeding lower quality and just making sure that they have it all the time to chew on, because that saliva also helps neutralize stomach acid a little bit. So it helps prevent ulcers. Having that pad of hay or forage that's being digested on their belly all the time is the best way to prevent stomach ulcers, making sure there's always something on their stomach.
Yeah.
And if that means feeding a lower quality hay, then that's fine, just so
Yeah.
they have something all the time.
No, and it was sort of a experiment or a little bit intuitive. So many horses that I cared for that had severe metabolic issues or horrible founder laminitic issues,
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
were on like literally a little handful of grain. And I kept
Mhm.
thinking, you're starving. And so I would increase vitamin, mineral supplements, anything that
Mhm.
was low sugar, but give them
Mhm.
more food. And that
Mhm.
actually, it just is taking care of them. That really seemed to work without me
Mhm.
knowing anything. And so you're kind of explaining why that would be better for them than keeping them in starvation mode.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can use slow feeder hay nets. There are a lot of horses that I know if you throw hay on the ground all the time, they're going to drag it through their stall or through the pasture or poop on it or whatever. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a lot of folks who use either the hay pillows that you can stuff and
Yep.
set on the ground, or slow feeder hay nets that hang on the wall. When you hang the hay nets, you just want to make sure that they're at least neutral, if not a little bit lower, because that changes the chewing pattern if it's
Yeah.
too high. But you can use things like that to sort of slow them down a little bit more, and not let them waste as much hay. But
Yes.
all of my metabolic horses, even the horses who are having, insulin crisis or greater than 200 on lab work, they are all on hay all the time, as much hay as we can keep in front of them, because that's how we start to turn off that insulin resistance as a survival mechanism, basically.
Interesting. And what
Mm-hmm.
about like soaking hay? Does that actually reduce the sugar content when people soak hay?
It will. Like I said, I still advise starting with hay that's low NSC to begin with, so that you don't
Mhm.
have to soak. A lot of horses won't eat it once it's soaked. They don't want it once it's wet. So then we're kind of being counterproductive with what we're trying to accomplish. But I think it is situational, whether to soak or not. It does work. It does leach out a lot of the nutrients in the hay, but at least they still have something that they can eat all the
Okay.
time. But it's very much a horse by horse basis, because if they won't eat it, we're not getting anywhere. But if they will eat it, and that's the only way you can get something that has a lower starch content by soaking it, then absolutely. And as long as they'll eat it, I don't think there's any harm in it. But I like to keep things very easy for folks. So soaking
Yes,
is not
yes.
something that's super
Yeah.
easy for most people.
No, but I mean, in Florida, getting hay is a big deal. And we don't
Mm-hmm.
always have a great selection of what kind of hay we can get or how long we can get certain types of hay. So hay is not as easy for us in some areas as it is in others.
Sure.
And
Mm-hmm.
so sort of having to look at how do we do that dance if we can only get in this super rich hay.
Right.
Do I just, and what about the forages? Like there's products out there that are supposed to be, I think there's one called Safe Starch or something it's a
Mm-hmm.
forage base of chop hay, but I
Mm-hmm.
think they add stuff to it because if you're buying pellets and cubes, it's usually just hay is the only ingredient. But
Right.
buying the forage, there seems to be more ingredients
Yes.
in there.
So in I won't call out any one brand in particular, but I'll go back to that conversation about reading the feed tag. I really don't care what's in that guaranteed analysis until we look at both active and inactive ingredients. And that goes for supplements too. Make sure you're reading your feed labels. And if it has soy, wheat, corn, molasses, or canola, it's probably not something you want to feed.
Okay.
Yeah, and depending on what you're feeding for, you may want to stay away from alfalfa too. It just depends, on your horse's bioindividuality and what they're dealing with, metabolically, medically, everything that goes
And would
along.
it be, other than like the pesticide issue,
Yeah.
would the alfalfa be better if we wanted more energy for a performance horse versus the Timothy, or do you think it matters?
I think, and I hate to just kind of lean into the bioindividuality thing, but I think it is a bioindividual. You have to take a bio-individual approach. There are some
Okay.
horses that they do better with oats. I have 100-mile endurance horses that we don't use the alfalfa because of the potential for the hindgut acidity, but they do really, really well on oats with coconut water. And they come through more hydrated, and they're kind of carb loading. We usually carb load a few days before the race, at every hole during the race and a few days after the race, just like we would an athlete, a
Right.
marathon runner or someone riding in the Tour de France. We need to have that extra storage. But I do have some horses, even within breeds, like thoroughbreds. Some of the thoroughbreds need the extra protein from an alfalfa or a sane foin. Some of them need more carbohydrate from the oats. It
Right.
really is a bio individual consideration, and sometimes it takes a little bit of playing around to figure out, one, what they want to eat, that they're happy with eating, and two, what they
Yes.
seem to be thriving on. But the biggest
Yeah.
obstacle is usually, what will they eat? Right?
Yeah,
So
what will they eat? And then what would be some of, like, I'm just thinking anybody listening to this podcast starts experimenting at home with or without a
right.
consultation with you.
Mm-hmm.
What would be some of the signs that the diet change is having positive effects? Like, what would be some of the earlier signs if somebody's going, okay, I'm going to quit feeding senior and I'm going to try hay pellets with a fat and a vitamin mineral supplement?
Mm-hmm.
What typically, and maybe it's too individual to answer this question, but are there typical general signs of improvement that people could look for?
There are. I think it's important to note that it takes 21 days, approximately, give or take. Again, it's a bio-individual thing,
Hmm.
but on average, it takes 21 days for a horse's microbiome to change. So, what we feed the horses are fueling or feeding the microbiota. So, those are the organisms, again, that are living in the gut. So, it takes about 21 days for those to change. So what's proliferating versus what's not thriving so well by what we're feeding. It takes 21 days for that to change. So in the beginning, people will say, oh, my horse hates this forage-based diet, or my horse doesn't like this, or my horse doesn't like that. I would encourage everyone to try to stick with it, because the microbiota are what is causing the craving within the horse. So if they go from eating senior, which is high molasses, high carbohydrate, to a forage-based diet, their microbiota are going to say, oh no, I want that sugar cocoa puffs,
Yes.
not this healthy cardboard stuff, which isn't actually cardboard, but they're just
Yeah,
not
no,
used
it
to it.
tastes like
So it
cardboard if
takes
you're
21 days for that microbiota to change over in the new direction. So that's about 3 weeks, right?
okay.
So you probably won't see your horse really take to the new diet for about 3 weeks.
Good to know.
But in the interim, the changes that you'll start to see usually happen within the coat. It gets a little shinier, a little less dull. A lot of horses explode in dapples. Um, Hoof quality, from the coronet band down, they grow from the coronet
Yep.
band down to the ground. That top section that's coming down from the coronet band will be usually of better quality than what's below it. And that's just an indication that your horse is absorbing fairly well, and that it's the body's able to use the new diet pretty well. And then personality. A lot of clients tell me they just seem a lot more relaxed. And I think
Mm,
that's a big indicator that they know, because they do have this innate wisdom that unfortunately we turn off by our training methods, our animal husbandry methods,
yes.
what we're feeding them. We force them into turning that innate wisdom off, but they do know what they need and they do know what they're supposed to be eating.
Yeah.
And so when we switch, I think their personality tells a lot. They all tend to like relax. And if they don't, again, if you don't see those things, usually there's something underlying going on, whether that's a metabolic issue, Lyme disease, EPM, something like that, or not quite the right balance of nutrients if they're not starting to thrive.
Yeah. And then do you find, I know on a case by case basis, like if a horse has been on, say, Presend for a
Mhm.
while, that's not something you're going to pull them off of right away. You're going to try to, or would you? Would you try to change medication right away when you guys are in your practice, or do you kind of ease it in and out based on the individuality of the horse?
Well, so the medications are outside my particular scope of practice because I'm
Okay.
not a vet. But I do collaborate with a lot of vets all over, obviously, because I have clients all over the country. But with Dr. Hancock, who owns True North that I work for, a lot of times we give diet somewhere between 30 to 60 days. And then we'll retest if we're talking about a metabolic condition, we'll retest and see how they're doing. And in some situations, she's able to make a plan to either wean them down to a lower dose and maintain them there,
Hmm.
or, depending on what the medication is, wean them off completely. Um, that it just depends again on how long
Yeah.
they've been in that state, how long they've been on the medication, and
And
working
that's really
closely.
going to be unique horse to horse. But that's
Yes.
exciting that especially working in True North in that vet practice that
Mhm.
the numbers don't lie. I go,
Right.
the proof is in the pudding,
Right.
that and even like that's what really solidified this idea that the first step of training is to get horses functioning with the parasympathetic nervous dominant, because I call it
Mhm.
the learning frame of mind. I go, you can't learn anything in the wrong
Right.
nervous system. And so
Right.
that becomes, and the proof is in the pudding. They change on a more permanent basis because, like you're saying, it's where the body wants to be, like a
Right.
homeostasis kind of thing.
Right. And that's in the human world, they talk about parasympathetic being your rest, digest, relax
Yes.
state. And so if you're stuck in sympathetic all the time, regardless of what the reason is, if you're stuck in sympathetic all the time, you can't rest, you can't
Yeah.
digest, and you can't relax. And all of those things aid in all of this inflammation and disease and chronic long-term issues.
Yes, absolutely. So I
Mhm.
have one last question. I know we're kind of
Sure.
nearing the end. But in the horse business, I go, we could spend our retirement savings on supplements.
Oh, yeah.
So where, because every problem a horse has, it's almost like the two things I see clients reaching for are supplements and new equipment. And I go, not going to help very much. And so where's your stance? And again, I know it's unique. Like some horses might need to be on super good probiotics for a short period of time. Other
Mhm.
horses might need excess fat supplement for a short period of time, or
Mhm.
how you're saying the different vitamin mineral supplements meet different needs of different horses. But
Mhm.
other than those, if they're on this diet, say over a longer and longer period of time, do you
Mhm.
find the need for supplementation goes down, or are there any supplements that you would say a horse having this issue is also going to need this supplement in addition to what you're talking about? Do you
That's a
follow? Am I
tough.
being clear?
Yes, it's a
Okay.
tough one because, okay, let me see if I can try to simplify it. So for me, um, beyond your forage and fat, which I don't count as being a
But
supplement, that's kind
right.
of your base. That's
That's your
really just
feed.
That's your carrier for your supplements. But with me, if I have a horse on more than 3 supplements, so that's vitamin, mineral, and then 2 others of whatever they need,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's a lot. So if you're feeding more than 3 supplements, you probably are creating an excess of something, which also means that you're creating a deficiency of something. Because once you go beyond that 3, maybe 4 supplement mark, you're going to have a lot of overlap of nutrients. So when I say that, we're talking like calcium, phosphorus, zinc,
Mm-hmm.
copper, all of those micronutrients. It's it's very hard to calculate and monitor how much of, for example, calcium you're getting when you're feeding 20 supplements, which
Right,
people
right.
do.
No, I have
So
mixed
I,
feeds. I know. It's like,
right,
yeah.
that's usually the first thing I do. If I have a client come to me who has, 8 supplements that they're feeding, the first thing we do is go, okay, what are we trying to accomplish with what you're feeding?
Mm-hmm.
And what supplement could we replace this with, or a couple supplements could we replace this with, that's giving you more nutrient value but still accomplishing what you're trying to do with all these supplements. So that's where that nutrient dense part of the diet that I like to use comes from, is we're getting the most bang for your buck as far as nutrients go without adding tons of supplements in.
Right.
And you're right, it is very bio individual, what a
Of
horse needs.
course, yes.
And even within a horse that comes to me with EPM, for example, even within that one disease, there can be a lot of different needs, whether it's, zinc to boost the immune system, or vitamin E to help counteract, the inflammatory response, or whether we need to block mast cell production because there's a lot of inflammation, the histamine reaction being caused by the protozoa that are floating around in the blood. It's very bio individual, even within just
Just
that
that. Yeah.
disease, which is overwhelming for people, and I don't want that to be discouraging. All horses will benefit from a forage-based diet, and I will go out on a limb and say all horses.
Okay.
um, if they are not thriving, it's because there's something else underlying, or some still misbalanced macro or micronutrients that you're just kind of missing, and so it just needs a little bit of tweaking from somebody who's savvy, who can help you figure out what
Yeah.
that is.
But that sounds
Hopefully we'll
much
all
more
do.
reasonable because it basically, I think having a horse here with severe allergies to almost all known horse foods, and he
Mm.
was actually allergic to Timothy, so he's been on a pretty heavy alfalfa diet. But I may
Mhm.
take another look at that or take a look at the sane foin.
Mhm.
But it's like when I started shopping feeds that he could eat, I'm like, there's nothing
Right.
without, he couldn't have corn, wheat, or soy. Those were like really high allergy reactions. And
Yeah.
he was getting inflammation in the joints. He wasn't
Oh
getting
yeah.
hives.
Yeah.
He was getting joint inflammation that was making him really cranky and not wanting to move.
And if you
And
notice, those 3 ingredients are all in my top 5 of
yes.
inflammatory ingredients. It's very
Yeah.
common. Most horses, if they have done allergy testing, most horses come back allergic to those 3.
And it was like off the charts high.
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
was interesting because he was like the first horse I had to put on basically straight alfalfa cubes. And that's how he's also allergic to flax. So it was like, okay, what fat
Right.
supplement? I did olive oil for a while, which was messy and cumbersome. And then I found
Right.
the cool stance, and
Mhm.
he's thrived on it.
Mhm.
But within 3 days, and this happened another time with a horse that was really aggressive that was in training, who ended up having PSSM, the
Mm.
polysaccharide
Yeah.
storage myopathy.
Yeah.
And within 3 days of this forage-based diet, they had personality transformations.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this one horse that was super aggressive, not the one with allergies, but the one that was really aggressive, we never did a biopsy. We just sort of went, the cheap way to find out is change the diet.
Mhm.
And he was so sensitive that even if a supplement had anything in it, that he was obviously any kind of sugar, he would
Right.
he would get aggressive again, even
Yeah.
from a supplement. So it was
Hmm.
like nothing in his diet could have molasses, sugar, or any like anything. It was just
Right.
strictly
Hmm.
hay and fat, and that was
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
But he,
Yes. And it's
and,
tough because there are six different variants, I think, of PSSM. I mean, there's PSSM1, but when I talk about the variants, that's usually PSSM2. And all of those little variants, one has a calcium dysregulation, one is, it's all, they all have these different little things. But for the most part, that the horses can't have, but for the most part, I find if you just get them switched to a forage-based diet with an appropriate vitamin mineral, they do really well. It's not nearly as complicated as everyone wants to make it out to
yeah.
be.
No, it
Mhm.
sounds like a much better strategy, and thank you, because like for equine nutrition basics, the topic of
Right.
this podcast,
We
it's
went
like,
down a lot of wormholes there, though. We got a little bit more than
yeah.
basic, but
No, but I have questions. I'd love to do another podcast because I have
sure.
big questions about like cribbing.
Yeah.
I think cribbing is digestive related, and I'm sure nutrition can make a huge difference with horses that crib.
Mhm.
And of course, anybody whose horse has been labeled IR or metabolic syndrome or PPID, all of a sudden
Mhm.
nutrition becomes way more important.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
I think that's a great place for people to start. And thank you for recommending some of the name brands too, because
Of
I think
course. Mhm.
there's so many products out there.
I know. And there's a lot of voices in the ocean, and it's hard to determine who to listen to and who not to listen to. And I'm not saying I am the expert on everything and know everything, but I can give the information that I do know, that I have experience working with, that I know works. But
Yeah.
I think the most important thing, regardless of whether someone opts to work with myself or any other nutritionist, is just to interview them and make sure that they're open to new concepts, that they're doing the research on their own to better their protocols, find out what their background is, because there are several nutritionists out there who call themselves nutritionists and say they have a PhD, but their PhD isn't actually in nutrition. And it
Uh,
doesn't necessarily mean that you have to work with a PhD who's a
hmm.
nutritionist or has a PhD in equine nutrition. There are a lot of us out there who don't have a PhD in equine nutrition that are very, very good. But it's just make sure you do a little bit of your homework and find out,
Yeah.
what their background is, whether they're, open to new ideas. And especially if you're trying to take this approach that I've been talking about, make sure they know what a forage-based diet is and how often they work with it. Because if they don't work with it often, they're probably not going to be able to help you very well with managing.
Balancing it
Yeah,
out for your
balancing and
horse.
managing. Hmm.
Yeah. And I think too, even just the simple delineation of speaking to someone who's independent
Yes, absolutely.
rather than part of a feed company
Or a supplement company. Yeah,
or a
because
supplement
it's the
company.
same situation. Hmm.
Yeah, because most of us get on the phone with the company selling the product
Right.
and go, what are the benefits? And we try it and it either
Right.
works or it doesn't. But
Right. It's more of a sales pitch than it is, what's actually going to be the best thing for your individual horse, which is
yeah.
part of why I've never um, associated myself directly with one feed company. I do carry the stable feed products, for
Hmm.
example, but only because they weren't in the area and I wanted to be able to say, let's try this and see, not so much that I'm, their food rep.
Right.
It's just accessibility was, more of the reason to start carrying it. But absolutely someone who's independent, not
Yeah.
paid directly by a feed
Yeah.
company is
Yeah.
or supplement company is your
It's
best bet.
important. Yeah.
Yes, very important.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to scheduling more podcasts because I think so little good information is out there to
Mhm.
actually help the horse owner
Right.
wade through this ocean of information, like you said, about supplements and diet and how do you even know, right?
Right.
Or is my horse going to be stuck on this medication forever? Is this like the
Right.
new deal? And we sort
Right.
of accept it like people health. And I go, but
Right.
there are things out there we can do to manage
Absolutely.
better.
Hmm.
So thank you so much for joining me. And like I
Thank you for
said,
having me.
I will put all of your contact information in the
Sure.
description box for the podcast so people
Hmm.
can reach out
Sure.
and hopefully schedule a consultation with you. Good to know you can do it from anywhere.
From anywhere.
Excellent. Excellent. With or without samples.
Right. With or without samples.
All right. So thanks everybody for joining us for another Horse Geeks podcast, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks. Bye.